All right, so I was listening to one of the podcasts on investing in stocks this morning, and they were talking about Bitcoin and on its recent run-up, and one of the things they brought up was, is Bitcoin a good inflation hedge? And they basically came to the conclusion that it wasn't, which I think is completely wrong, and I'll get into in a minute here. First things first, if you get value out of this video, please like, subscribe, comment, really appreciate all that stuff. So their argument was kind of, incredibly poor in my opinion. Basically, the only real thing that they said was it's volatile. The other thing they said, it's just not a good inflation hedge. Well, technically, that depends on how you define inflation hedge. That's the only caveat that I would throw out here, is that it certainly does depend on how you define that. But the only way that you could define that in a way to where they would be right is if your definition of inflation hedge must have very low volatility. But they've said time and time again that stocks are better inflation hedge than bonds are, and stocks are obviously more volatile than bonds. So that argument doesn't hold water. And that argument, I think, is insane, because if you look at bonds, you're getting whatever 4%, when the cost of housing, I'm not sure about the states. When you look at going back about a decade, prices have roughly doubled. In Canada, they've more than doubled. So if you had your money just in bonds, you would not have kept up with inflation. So the idea that bonds are a good inflation hedge is, I think it's a laughably terrible argument, considering you wouldn't even have kept up with inflation, let alone actually made a little. Stocks clearly are a decent inflation hedge. Gold, so-so. I think Bitcoin is clearly superior, and I've been into that a million times. But I think the most important thing here is, how do you define inflation hedge? That's the key thing. And I think the key, my way to define it would be, well, what has done the best job at preserving your capital if you had invested in it? And this chart here very clearly shows that Bitcoin has done by far the best job of that. There isn't even a close second. And if you go back a decade, it took about, exactly as of December 1st, 2014, it took 436 Bitcoin to buy a house. As of October 1st, 2024, it takes 4.62 Bitcoin to buy a house. So as far as being priced in Bitcoin terms, the average house in the US, obviously other countries are going to be a little different, the average house in the US has gotten almost 100 times cheaper. There isn't another asset to where I don't think there's another asset where it's probably even gotten 10 times cheaper, let alone 100 times. Now, I don't expect that to happen over the next decade, but I do still expect Bitcoin to easily outperform virtually all, if not all, other asset classes. My base case for Bitcoin is 20-30% return, and I know there's large discrepancies between a 20 and a 30% return. I'm just throwing out numbers off the top of my head, but I think 20 is the minimum, 30, 40, 50% maybe on the high end is what I expect from Bitcoin. I could be wrong, but I could be wrong on the upside as well. For all we know, it could be down to a half a Bitcoin to buy a house in the next decade. And if you assume that the average house doubles over the next 10 years, because it's roughly done that over the last 10 years, that would imply that the average house would be about $650,000, which would mean Bitcoin would have to be 1.3 million in 2034. Would that surprise anyone if Bitcoin's at 1.3 million? That's probably a little bit more than I would project, but honestly, that's probably roughly. I think we'll be well over 1 million Canadian. I would project this halving cycle we go to 200,000-300,000. The next one after that, we probably flirt with 1 million, and then the one after that, we're probably flirting with over 2, maybe 1.5, 2. So that would be 2032. So yeah, I think that it's perfectly realistic that we're at 1.5 ish million in 10 years. Like that's over 2 halving cycles from now. So I don't think people realize just how good of an opportunity it is. Obviously, Bitcoin comes with a lot of risk. That's something that I point out time and time again. I'm not saying that that isn't the case, but I think one of the biggest mistakes that investors make, and I was reading the Market Wizards book, one of them recently, and one of the traders, I don't remember which one it was, but one of the things that they said, word for word, was too many people. Like, what was the biggest mistake that you think people make, or what is the biggest mistake you think average people make? And he said, confusing short-term volatility with long-term risk. And I think that is the perfect way of describing Bitcoin. People think that because it has a lot of short-term volatility, that it's super risky long-term, but the data clearly doesn't show that. Like, the data shows the exact opposite, if anything. Like, this is about as clear as you can possibly get. Yeah, there's a lot of short-term volatility, but over the long term, it's quite clear. Like, it's incredibly clear. So that's just what I wanted to point out here. But a lot of people say, well, what's the biggest concern with Bitcoin? And the thing that I pointed out time and time again that not enough people are talking about is a lot of regular people, but the more concerning thing, I think, is a lot of these traditional finance guys, and I mean, there's some girls as well, they're not going to admit they're wrong. Like, they're just not going to admit they're wrong. I mean, some of these people have been telling you not to buy Bitcoin for a decade when you could have 100x'd your money. Like, the problem with that, though, is that I think we're going to get to the point to where so many people have made so much money that it's impossible to ignore. Like, why am I paying, like, average people, like, most people aren't going to come to grips with this. I've said this time and time again as well. But you're going to have a significant minority of people that are going to realize, why am I paying a fund manager 200 basis points to get me 8, 9, 10% per year when I can put my money in Bitcoin, pay nothing, and get double, triple those returns? Like, why would I do that? Like, eventually people are going to realize that. I don't think the majority of people will wake up anytime soon, but that number is going to go up because over time, there's going to be more and more people that are going to become moderately wealthy or very wealthy. And people are going to think, like, why in the world am I giving my money to this guy who's getting me mediocre returns when my cousin over here, who's 40 years old and they're retiring and they're a multimillionaire? It's simply because they put 5-10% of their portfolio, or maybe more, depending, into Bitcoin. Like, people are gonna come to grips with that. And not only that, some of these fund managers are also going to be like, hey, if you want to have your money in registered accounts, well, you need to do it through a broker. Well, let me do it, and I'll get way better returns. I'll destroy these other fund managers that refuse to get with the times, and the money will start flowing towards those people. Like, that's going to happen as well. So I still think that a lot of people aren't going to admit they're wrong. But on the flip side, I think it's going to become too much for people to ignore, for some people. So that's kind of my base case for Bitcoin. But long story short, Bitcoin clearly is a very good inflation hedge. And the reason for that is that it's been the best inflation hedge going back 15 years. And a lot of people pretend like, oh, it's a super new asset. We don't know this, we don't know that. And to some degree, they're true. But I mean, at some point, you need to acknowledge you're wrong. And this is another thing that I really dislike about a lot of these people, is that they never acknowledge what it's going to take for them to admit they're wrong. Like, if Bitcoin continues to destroy every other asset for 20, 30, 40, like, how many years is it going to take for you to admit you're wrong? Like, that's my question. Like, how long will it take? And the last thing is, yes, it's a good inflation hedge. Yes, it's better than anything else. The question is, okay, well, how much do you put in? Entirely up to you. I did acknowledge that it is very clearly risky, but especially when you're younger, you got to be taking some risk, especially nowadays with inflation and the cost of living being so out of control. If you don't take at least a moderate amount of risk, in my opinion, you're gonna get left behind. Like, you're gonna get left behind. So that is what I wanted to bring up today. If you liked the video, you got value, please like, subscribe, comment. Really appreciate all that, and stay tuned for more.